Dr. Denia Djokić is our guest today, and we are very excited to have her here. She represents an extremely unique intersection between nuclear engineering and science and technology studies and international governance that you're just not going to find in any other human. So I hope you'll sort of move your hands away from your keyboards, close your other browsers, and try to pay close attention. Her knowledge and experience is really unmatched and super unique. It's been a very interesting career, which I will tell you all about. She is currently holding 3 interesting positions. One, she is a researcher in energy, equity, and society in the Nuclear Engineering and Radiological Sciences Department at the University of Michigan. She has also just recently been named a 2021 Levanek Resident Scholar here in Sustainability Leadership at the University of Illinois at Champaign. And she is also an associate at the Project on Managing the Atom at the Harvard Kennedy School's Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. That's where she was a postdoctoral research fellow from 2018 to 2019. Between 2019 and 2020, she was a visiting research fellow at the Program for Science, Technology, and Society, also at that Harvard Kennedy School of Government. Before that, from 2015 to 2017, she served as an advisor on issues of policy and governance in science, technology, and innovation for the government of Ecuador. So her research interests are broad, and they cover social and environmental justice impacts of governance of nuclear energy and technology, particularly through modes of inquiry grounded in science and technology studies and feminist scholarship. Her past research projects have encompassed technical and policy issues in radioactive waste management and advanced fuel cycle systems analysis. She holds a master's degree and PhD in nuclear engineering with a designated emphasis in energy science and technology from the University of California, Berkeley, where she was a U.S. Department of Energy Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management graduate student fellow. The last, in fact, Akram fellow, as that office was closing. She holds a bachelor's degree in physics from Carnegie Mellon University. And I hope you will pay very close attention to Dr. Djokić. As you can see, her background is completely unique, and she will come with a really fascinating kind of set of perspectives. So hands off your keyboards, focus, and it doesn't hurt to show your screen, show your face, and make her feel welcome. So I will turn it over to Dr. Djokić. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Professor Huff, for that extremely kind and generous introduction. Indeed, I was the last Office of Civilian Radioactive Waste Management Fellow. I had actually forgotten about that. I even was a fellow after the office closed, which is a whole other story. If anyone wants to talk about it, I'm happy to talk about that. Hi, everyone. I'm so honored to be here. Thank you all for being here and for having me and inviting me and listening to what I have to say. I'm going to start sharing my screen so that, 1 second. So that it will make more sense when wait, I'm confused. Okay.
Looks good.
Looks good? All right, 1 second. I just need to figure out how to, how do I feel like I'm in a room but don't cover my slides? I think
Is that the floating toolbar problem?
It's the floating toolbar problem.
There are 3 dots on the right, and there's a way to make it go away.
Yeah, but I don't want it to go away entirely. I just want to make it smaller, but it seems like it's not working. So don't worry, I'll just figure it out. Pay no attention. So, hi, I will not repeat. I was going to introduce myself, but Katie very nicely did that for me already. So I'm just going to repeat. Thank you again for having me. And my talk, as you can see, is titled Care and Repair in Nuclear Power Practices and Policy. Not exhaustively, I just like the PPP alliteration, but it extends to many other realms in the nuclear field. And I wanted to say that today's conversation might be a little different than the ones you have traditionally had in this seminar series, but I hope that it can spark some some good conversation today and in the future, between us and amongst all of you as well. So all right. I would like to start with something that is sort of the elephant in the room. I would be remiss not to mention the two big anniversaries that we just commemorated last Thursday. That of the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant accident 10 years ago, and that of the WHO declaring COVID-19 a global pandemic exactly 1 year ago, plus a few days now. I managed to dig up two photos from my personal archive, one on the left from a lecture at Berkeley while I was a graduate student, and one on the right from my office at Harvard last year during my postdoc. These two photos capture a common spirit of these two monumental events and sort of global moments of reckoning. The uncertainty, fear, and the desperate measures and shreds of knowledge that we scrambled for in the face of the mounting crisis. So everyone, of course, remembers what last year was like. I'm not sure how many people in this room were nuclear engineers when the Fukushima Daiichi accident happened. I'd be curious. I wish I could say, please raise your hand, but I only have 4 little boxes on my screen currently, but I would love to maybe address this in the Q&A and just kind of hear from you all. Fukushima was a humbling and disastrous moment for the entire nuclear industry. It was also a litmus test of the trust of institutions to avoid, or even just to handle when they do happen, disasters of such scale, not unlike this COVID moment or any large-scale modern industrial disaster. This talk, however, is not about nuclear power plant accidents per se, and it's not about socio-technical risk per se, although we could fill volumes of books with that. And it's not about global pandemics or disasters per se either, but it is about examining the building blocks that have constructed this complex risk society, as the sociologist Ulrich Beck describes, that we live in, and how institutions navigate incredibly complex socio-technical risk and the trust necessary in these institutions that accompanies it. And this will lead us talking about notions of care and repair later in the talk, as indicated by my title. So right now in this moment, as the whole world reflects and introspects on systemic risk and the undeniable social injustices that arise from and or are laid bare by it, we are starting to challenge the implicit assumptions underlying our entire social order. It's getting heavy really fast. I apologize, we'll back up. So that said, I would like to shift the focus onto myself, not because I love to center myself, but because I think it's important to tell you about myself and about my background in order to be able to situate my work for you in a transparent manner, which is something that critical science studies and feminist scholarship consistently advocates. So kind of tying into Katie's introduction of me, after my master's and PhD and my first postdoc in the nuclear engineering discipline at UC Berkeley, I briefly left the field to work as a scientific advisor for the Ecuadorian government, which is where I'm calling from at the moment, not the government, but the country. I'm in Quito right now. So greetings from the equator. Subsequently, I reintegrated myself into the nuclear field with this new perspective that I was able to experience here. I reintegrated myself into the nuclear field at the Harvard Kennedy School, where I started doing research in nuclear policy. There, I found the Science, Technology, and Society program, which put me on a path to integrating through a critical lens all of my previously accumulated experience. I currently, thus, describe myself as something that Science and Technology Studies calls a boundary object that is shared between the epistemic communities of nuclear engineering, nuclear energy policy, science policy, and science and technology studies, and more specifically, feminist science and technology studies. My work thus sits on the disciplinary boundaries of science and technology studies and nuclear engineering, with the objective of finding points of dialogue and common conversation between the critical science studies world and spaces of nuclear knowledge production. Something that we could call the nuclear academic industrial laboratory policy complex, which includes universities, national labs, government entities, and international organizations, the nuclear industry, think tanks, and so on. I'm sure you're all familiar with all these spaces. Some broad guiding questions of this kind of work are: what constitutes the institutions of our discipline, of our nuclear discipline, culturally and epistemically? What moral frameworks are they either explicitly or implicitly operating in? And how does this influence the technologies we build and the decision-making processes around them? So, just to show you, in anticipation, that I am not the only epistemic hybrid trying to philosophize about science and technology, I feel the need to point out that MC Hammer's got my back. He's on our side. And I should also point out that I am not the only epistemic hybrid in this virtual room right now. And I hope that we have time later in the Q&A for those voices to come out. No pressure. I'm not going to put you on the spot, but I'm just saying that I'm not the only one out there. So. All right. So in the spirit of situating my work, here are some of the work that I have leaned on, as well as participated in producing, specifically one article on this slide. It is a widely theorized phenomenon that in the institutions of scientific knowledge production, which is what we call them, the dominant cultural fabric woven through these institutions rests on Western notions of scientific rationality, value-free objectivity, and good research methods. While I don't want to posit disputing any of these, I do want to challenge some of the implicit notions that these values are resting on. Technical expertise has been an important variable in the modernizing policies of post-war governments. These same notions and values are thus equally present in the institutions and epistemic communities producing nuclear knowledge and technology. But to be able to see and intellectually deconstruct these embedded values, I've been doing a lot of digging into scholarship in other epistemic corners of thought. So here I show a very much non-exhaustive reading list of mostly feminist, decolonial, and STS, and the combinations of all of the above scholarship that has recently influenced me. And one article, as I mentioned, being one I have co-written with actually two of my colleagues who are in the audience today. Drs. Madikin Monk and Aditi Verma. And another article that Dr. Verma published last week, you can see it in the bottom right corner, Accidents, Paradox, and the Epistemic Future of Nuclear Policy. I highly recommend that you all look it up and read it. This is just a start to a recommended reading list for learning and unlearning. So unlearning is part of learning as well, which is a whole other conversation. But I wanted to share with you some of my favorite works that engage with the ethics of care, the role of diverse standpoints in the construction of knowledge, and how language reflects and reinforces institutional cultural norms. So an implicit message for nuclear academic institutions here is, please make space for this kind of reflexivity and learning, and hire people to teach these works. Part of me, wants you all to read it, but I know you're all slammed with lots of work. But if you had this as an assignment in a class, ... Also, this will sound like a shameless plug, but I really do sincerely want you all to read a forthcoming paper by myself and Dr. Verma in Issues of Science and Technology, where we engage with the need for epistemic modernization and innovation of thought in the nuclear engineering field. So stay tuned. Specifically in that paper, we critique that historically in institutions of nuclear knowledge production, we critique the dominant culture of objectivity, leaving out subjective standpoints, dynamics of power relations, especially along race, gender, class lines that remain largely invisible, and narratives of justice and equity largely absent in nuclear policy and decision-making, especially historically. And we suggest how to address this so we can center historically marginalized voices that have been disproportionately affected by the social and environmental impacts of nuclear technology. So why unlearning anyway? Aren't we doing just fine? Besides, we're figuring out the safety and the risk problem, right? Like we're building SMRs, we're building fancy new reactors in general. We're going towards clean energy, utopian futures. But actually it's not that simple, right? While all of these are necessary, technological fixes are simply not enough. Let's unpack this a little bit. The unpacking is basically why, well, never mind. Let's unpack this. So first of all, let's start with the age-old anti-pro nuclear dichotomy, which I guess everyone is familiar with in this room. This started way before many of us were born and continues into the present. And one of my sort of projects is to intervene in this anti-pro dichotomy and try and reframe the conversation around nuclear technology as not dichotomous, and try and have more nuanced conversations centered around justice and equity, as opposed to just anti-pro, a thing. So I don't need to go through the history of this, the 70s and 80s, Chernobyl, TMI, the lull in the 90s, the nuclear renaissance in the mid 2000s, which is when I became a graduate student. But I will say that when the 2011 Fukushima Daiichi accident happened after the Tohoku earthquake and tsunami took out 3 of the 6 reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. After this accident, the field saw the birth, or perhaps more of a growth spurt, of a new generation, of which present company is included. A new generation of nuclear engineers that started questioning the presuppositions of their field and firmly held conceptions about risk and safety. So there was a shift there was a shift within the nuclear epistemic community, and lots of calls left and right for reevaluations of these notions of risk, and also technological hubris, and calls for an adoption of humility by nuclear technology experts. 10 years on, things have shifted a little, but we have mostly been focusing our disciplinary energies on things like new reactor designs, rather than on a broader epistemic reevaluation and process redesign, although that has happened a little bit as well. So I don't want to necessarily be super fatalistic about that either. There's another article I would like to point you to called Technologies of Humility, in which the author Sheila Jesinoff makes a call, I will quote, "A call for humility, a plea for policymakers to cultivate and for universities to teach modes of knowing that are often pushed aside in expanding scientific understanding and technological capacity. It is a call for policy analysts and policymakers to re-engage with the moral foundations for acting in the face of inevitable scientific uncertainty." The related notion of epistemic humility goes back to Immanuel Kant and David Hume, and perhaps even to Socrates, depending on how far back you want to go. More recently, though, critical and post-colonial theory has engaged with notions of other ways of knowing beyond epistemologies that stem from Western thought. I will say that while I personally strongly agree with the call for epistemic humility, I would like to posit that humility is a necessary but not sufficient virtue. It does not necessarily break down this anti-pro nuclear energy dichotomy that will either always be a barrier to nuclear energy implementation, or framed differently, always be a manifestation that the wishes of some part of the population is not being listened to. Humility might help bridge the divide and open up possibilities for a discipline to sit with what Steve Rayner called uncomfortable knowledge. And it helps open the doors to engaging with other ways of knowing and thinking, but it does not necessarily inherently put all ways of knowing on an equal level or center justice in decision-making processes rather than the technology itself. And centering the technology itself is a manifestation of what we call teleological attachment to a technology. So an attachment to your profession and its artifacts above all else. This is one of the ingredients needed to break down this anti-pro dichotomy in discourse about nuclear energy, which in turn is what is needed, or what I believe is what is needed in order to be able to engage with nuanced questions around this technology as we continue to move forward with that, which in turn is what generates trust, which is exactly what the nuclear industry has massively lost over the past several decades. So, while we're on the anti-pro narratives topic, let's examine some more specific manifestations of these narratives that persist to this day and are perpetuated by narratives and culture on sort of both sides of the anti-pro divide, if we want to keep the language of the dichotomy, that keep entrenching the nuclear dichotomy and keep leading us to an impasse. And I've tried to sort of pick from both sides of the divide that I mentioned. These are non-exhaustive, and I definitely picked a certain theme on purpose. I think you can tell what the theme is. But anyway, it's for illustrational purposes. These particular examples show the richness of how language and narratives reflect, or at least partially and historically especially, the nuclear industry. And I don't mean to indict the nuclear industry necessarily, but this does, and I do have great hope for it, which is why I continue to work inside of it. Or I should say the nuclear field, not the industry. But I will say that I have personally had many experiences with these kinds of narratives. So this is also a very personal story for me, as well as an ethnographic one. So it's not hard to see that a lot of these are explicitly gendered. Like I said, I picked them for illustrative purposes of my own choosing. Either harnessing and encouraging or belittling and shaming the fear of women, mothers, or the archetypal 50s housewife here in the middle. So these mostly sexist tropes mirror larger societal tropes and values. The fear of objective knowledge is often belittled and shamed, which we have seen also a lot in the COVID pandemic over the past year, rather than engaged with to build or to rebuild trust and confidence. In other words, it's easier to dismiss inconvenient viewpoints than do the hard work. And do the hard work correctly. And I mean to say this from both sides of the divide. I don't mean to just indict one side or the other. Like, we're all equally culpable of all this. Attitudes of care are seen, again, remember, these are tropes, right? These are stereotypes. I'm illustrating stereotypes. Attitudes of care are seen as weak. The effect on women and racialized and otherwise marginalized people of systemic bias is understudied. Institutionally, women and racialized and otherwise marginalized people are not supported in a slew of different ways. And specifically in the nuclear field, this has manifested, these tropes have manifested by, for example, and again, this is not exhaustive and it's also not a rule, it's an observation that I have seen over a decade and a half of being in this field. And also this has been studied, so it's not just me. For example, belittling subfields of study that are explicitly care-oriented, such as radioactive waste management and radiation health physics, and anything to do with environmental and sort of like oriented around the biological side of things. The understudying of even effects of radiation itself on women in marginalized communities, and not just radiation, but also industrial processes related to the nuclear fuel cycle. As highlighted in a recent UNIDIR report, which I will show you in the next slide. So all of these, I guess, what I'm trying to get to is that we tend to marginalize the voices of care in our larger society, and specifically in the nuclear industry. So I would like to draw your attention to that. And I would also be remiss to point out that over the last year during the pandemic, care work has been highlighted as an indispensable and extremely underpaid sector of labor that continues to be the most vulnerable sector in this pandemic, or one of the most vulnerable, I should say. So, pay attention to the dominant voices in the nuclear field. Who are the people that are saying what? And I shouldn't say in the nuclear field. I should keep saying on both sides. Sorry, I get kind of. I need to be more inclusive with my language. Practice what I preach. Are these voices representative? And spoiler alert, usually they're not. The dominant voices in the nuclear field have generally historically fallen along gender, racial, and class lines. And we're trying to change that. There's a massive effort now to remedy that. Recently, I have looked to feminist and post-colonial scholarship to help me elucidate some of these invisible operating assumptions of our field. Not surprisingly, feminist, indigenous movements of the past have a fraught history with the nuclear industry, as well as other movements such as the Black Movement for Nuclear Disarmament, for example. And with that, I will point you to Vincent Intondi's book, also highly recommended reading, that I didn't include visually in this presentation, but I will verbally point you to it. As Dorothy Nelkin writes here on the right, the feminists have had an impact on the nuclear industry in a variety of ways and through a variety of political positions, which responded. Sorry, I made some brackets, some changes in the language that doesn't quite grammatically make sense, but anyway, which was responded to by promoting pro-nuclear women to public relations positions. So I understand that this resistance is one against either oppressive treatment or perceived oppressive treatment, and broken trust, actually broken trust above all. But I also wonder how we can revisit this divide and do the feminist thing, in my opinion, to reestablish trust on both sides, and whether and how feminist scholarship could be brought to the nuclear field to do so. And I don't just mean let's make another activist group that showcases pro-nuclear women. I mean, how can we build feminist philosophies into the design and decision-making processes of the nuclear field? Oh, and on the left here is the UNIDIR report that I mentioned in the last slide. So one of the guiding, or I don't know if guiding, but one major concept to be produced from, as well as critiqued by, actually, so it's nuanced, feminist scholarship is the ethical framework of care. First theorized by Heidegger to characterize the structure of being, then brought into feminist scholarship by the psychologist Carol Gilligan at Harvard in the 80s. Joan Tronto, a political scientist, has also characterized care as the moral quality of life, and how that moral quality needs to be transformed into a political reality. So one main takeaway from this slide is that the ethics of care in sort of the main field of Western ethical theories provides a fourth pillar on top of utilitarian ethics, deontological ethics and virtue ethics. So it refocuses decision-making on moral grounds of that center relationships and people or situations requiring care. Another concept that was very important that I started off my talk with, coming out of feminist scholarship, is our standpoint theories and this concept of situated knowledges, which is based on the work by feminist scholars such as Dorothy Smith, Sandra Harding, and Donna Haraway. In other words, the ideas, so what situated knowledges and standpoint theory means is basically the idea that the knower is reflected in the knowledge produced. Remember MC Hammer? I don't know if you read it, but buried in one of his tweets was, when you measure, include the measure. This idea challenges Western notions of scientific rationality, value-free objectivity, and good research methods, but also posits that some version of objectivity can be strived towards by incorporating diverse viewpoints into the production of knowledge. And this is very, very important. So this idea is part of feminist scholarship's development of standpoint theories, which elucidates how dominant ways of thought do not represent those of marginalized social groups. So what I'm trying to say here is I'm not trying to throw objectivity out the window, but I'm saying how we have historically constructed objectivity and notions around rationality and objectivity is not representative of the larger population. The scholar Maria Puig de la Bellacasa recently wrote about how care and standpoint theory are related. In her book, Matters of Care, she explores how knowing and thinking are irrevocably linked to the multitude of relations and relationships between humans, things, and nature. And I've included a quote from her here that I love. That knowledge is situated means that knowing and thinking are inconceivable without the multitude of relations that make possible the worlds we think with. So, what does care and repair, so I'm kind of throwing in this notion of repair in a little bit randomly, but bear with me, I'm gonna try and address it here. What does care and repair look like in nuclear policy? As the new US administration embarks on repairing sort of decades of damage, and well, as well as the last 4 years of damage, but let's not get into that. It really seems to have understood the above call, or at least so far. I have high hopes. I think it was last week or maybe 2 weeks ago that Jennifer Granholm told the Waste Management Symposia attendees that the Department of Energy was doubly, maybe even quadruply committed, I forget the exact language that she used, to environmental remediation and cleanup projects. I think this is promising, but I also want to point out that care and repair in the nuclear field aren't necessarily only limited to environmental cleanup. And this is where we can start talking about reparations to communities that have been affected for decades. And secondly, even these ongoing cleanup operations stop short of the monumental task that ideally should be done, such as, so I have to choose my language carefully here. So I'm just cherry picking an example here, but in this mission and priorities bar, if you go to the list and you see sort of the list of the environmental management tasks, the cleanup projects that are going on, only one, as far as I can tell, is a cleanup project that is situated near Indigenous communities, and that is the Moab Mill tailings pile. Everything else is on national lab territory or near national lab territory. And I'm sorry, I will correct myself, Hanford is also one of them. that is near indigenous territory. But there are also, I think the number is around 500 unremediated uranium mines that the EPA is actually in charge of. So here you start seeing sort of the institutional limitations of kind of our implementation of our values. So yeah, these other 500 plus, I think, abandoned uranium mines that still need cleanup are on or near indigenous land, which, you know, according to utilitarian ethics, like, it's just fine. We're facing a climate crisis. Like, we can't prioritize this right now. But I'm here to sort of challenge that again around the notion of caring for marginalized, historically marginalized communities. And we can get into kind of questions as to why, and, you know, it's not profitable, and, or, you know, why haven't funds been put towards this? And that's a whole other conversation. And I truly believe that there are very well-meaning people in these institutions whose hands are just tied, right, by the decades-long institutional rigid structures that we've implemented. So anyway, I will also, no, I'm going to skip this. All right, because I want to leave time to actually talk to you all. So in its most general form, this talk is a call for a reconceptualization of the practices and logics of the nuclear field. It's unfortunately not as simple as just informing policy, which is something I got a lot of pushback on while being a fellow in the nuclear policy world. But it's really more of a cultural shift. We have to do the work to really like think differently about historical processes. And you know, if you want to go hashtag sustainability is not just clean energy and windmills, et cetera. It's a cultural shift. It's kind of building in justice and equity in a sustainable way into your institutions and your processes around our technologies, any technology. So I'm positing in this talk that we should make care a structuring principle for practices and institutions. We should also make it synonymous with justice in a certain sense. So with that, I mean care as an expression of solidarity amongst people and between also human and non-human worlds, as a means to justice through repair. So that's a whole lot of meaning in one tiny little sentence that we can deconstruct forever, but I'm just going to leave it there. So far, our field's practices have expressed different values, mostly utilitarian, as I have mentioned, which have led, unfortunately, this kind of thinking has led to racial injustices being perpetuated over the decades, such as the still unmitigated effects of uranium mining on indigenous populations, as I mentioned, as well as global injustices all over the board you know, there are questions of mining, climate, development, again, a whole other can of worms. So in the end, what does centering care as a structuring principle look like in practical terms? So I'm not trying to reinvent the wheel. There's a ton of scholarship that I have presented in this talk, and also a lot of environmental justice literature that engages with exactly this question. There are organizations that have successfully, smaller organizations, but still that have successfully sort of implemented, or well, successfully is a loaded word, but have attempted to implement these sorts of philosophies and build these values into their processes. And they have addressed how to incorporate specifically distributive and procedural justice in different contexts. The nuclear field, our field, is also not immune to these broader calls for social and environmental justice. But I have to say it is a monumental task how to incorporate it into our practices and policies. It's hard. I'm not saying it's easy. Like, I can get up here and wax poetic for half an hour about what we should do, and with like all the respect in the world for how difficult it is. But I will say that one of the places that we need to start with is actually what the Biden administration, and I'm not being paid by the Biden administration, but they are starting to do just this, which is bringing in different knowledges, people, and voices, and expanding culture and mindsets into, expanding decision-making processes to incorporate a diversity of culture and mindsets, and thus addressing issues of procedural justice, for example. So I think that we need to reshift the focus of our practices in the nuclear field to care in process before jumping to outcome. Again, keeping in mind that the anti-pro-nuclear dichotomy, like let's detach ourselves from the actual technologies and focus on process more than the thing itself. Processes should be participatory, not top-down. This is obvious. We should incorporate historical experiences of marginalized communities at the same time as looking to the future. So we need to bring the voices of the marginalized to the center, not only looking forward, but also looking towards the past. And, and sit with, even though we're relatively all new to this field, like we've entered into this, we've got a responsibility to, take what our grandparents have given us and do the best we can with it. So, whoops, no, I cannot swipe on my laptop. There we go. Just, oops. Some closing words. I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts and encouragements that I would like you to take with you in your future conversations while you're being reflexive about your practice as nuclear engineers. So care and repair applies to care and repair applies not only to environmental damage, but also to trust and health of human beings. Though of course it's all related. A key component of trust is changing our field's culture to go beyond pitting the anti-nuclears and the pro-nuclears against each other. It's not just, I'm going to repeat myself again. So it's not just about the technology per se, but it's about the values that the technology and its implementation and the historical injustice is perpetuated, and what this represents to different people, which actually I would like to turn around and say it gives us an opportunity, realizing this gives us an opportunity to engage with those values, and sort of have a talk about the values in the trust rebuilding process rather than about the technology, right? And how safe a technology is or not, but rather look at the greater social and historical context in the trust building project. I also really, really encourage you not to dismiss difficult concepts and conversations in the nuclear field. I encourage you to be curious about and engage with the critique that is leveled against our field, and lean into the messiness and complexity of the issues. It's really fascinating what you can find. And you're not always going to solve everything, but it will expand your thinking and your relationship with your profession. Also, lastly, be aware of your positionality and don't doubt your intuition of what is just and what is not. Stop letting larger interests and implicit assumptions that are sort of embedded in the logics of our field put you on sort of what I call engineering autopilot. Challenge the mental models on which our discipline is based in an effort to center justice and care and not division and exclusion. And I think that's how we can build a better field and a more inclusive field. So I just want to throw up some names here that is also a non-exhaustive list, but and again, many of these people, at least 3 of these people are in the audience right now. And thank you all for being part of my network of care, my web of care. Please feel free to email me about anything, any questions or thoughts you might have. Thanks.
All right, listening to Dr. Djokić, and I am certain that many of you have questions about this. Oh, I see Dr. Abelson already has one. Go right ahead, John.
Thank you. Hi, John Abelson. I teach in our Energy and Sustainability Engineering program. It's here in the NPRE department. So I love so many things about your talk, and I very deeply appreciate how, from the current context, that the things you're talking about, establishing trust, care, and repair, moving away from dichotomy, justice, these are the places we need to move to now. What I wanted to ask about, though, is a somewhat longer view, because in our class, one thing we do from day one with the students is to talk about the multiple aspects of anything you do. In engineering speak, trade-offs, but use of land, water, capital, influence on people. And one arrives at the conclusion that all approaches have various consequences, right? There's no free lunch, and people that look at, for example, I'm an old solar cell guy, people who look at the area requirements of solar realize the ecological implications are really quite big. So as you look towards an eventual, I'll call it steady state, everyone is affected in various ways by any of the choices we make. Do you perhaps have a few words of wisdom? How do your perspectives address not just who's been most affected in the last perhaps 50 years, but how do your perspectives affect the ongoing challenge, the inescapable challenge of dealing with complexity and trade-offs? I'm
Thank
sorry,
you
it
for
was
the
a long question.
No, and that's okay. It's a very good one, and I will attempt to answer it by going back to the idea of process, not outcome. So when you invoke the steady state, I am one person. I can't tell you what that steady state is, especially in a world of increasing shocks and sort of so-called black swan events that kind of upend the social order, but at the same time are a manifestation of our current social order.
Yep.
So I will invoke again the idea of process. Wait, I just said that, didn't I? It's not about what is the steady state. It's about who gets to have a say in the steady state, and is that a democratic process? Democratic with a capital or a lowercase d. It's also a loaded term, but the point is, do we marginalize? Are we just a bunch of engineers sitting in a classroom thinking about what our future utopia looks like, and what are kind of optimal trade-off mix of energy sources look like? And do we decide in our little room, or do we say, okay, nobody knows, we have to do something, here are all the problematics and here are all the trade-offs, and there's no silver bullet, and who do we invite into that room? And even just using the word invite, as indicates sort of a problematic that is often invisible to us in these academic spaces. So I would recenter the question around that, around who is part of the process of just determining the steady state, not the what.
By the way, that's lovely, because one of the things that we discuss with the class is the issue of, you have many different quantities, and how do you even begin to approach, as the economists would say, valuation? Whether or not your common denominator is $1 or some other unit. Right, and we're evidently willing to accept a lot of different things depending on the discourse. So if you permit me to use, the parlance of economics, you're really saying that the valuation is that which emerges from the dialogue.
No, I'm saying the valuation is the diversity of the dialogue itself and the representation. but I don't like the word evaluation to begin with, so it's a little bit of a
Okay.
Yeah. Anybody else? Thank you for that
Islam
question.
has a, Professor Udine has a question in the chat. It says, metrics based on outcome are easy. Are there metrics for care and repair and for the directed towards justice participatory process? Or is this a wrong question? Great question, Rizwan.
That is also yes, it is a very good question.
When do we declare success? That's the point. When do we say,
Sorry?
oh, yeah, we have done it? When would you?
I think that's impossible to answer, right?
That's what I thought. I thought it was the wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it's not necessarily the wrong question per se, because the fact that you even asked whether this was the wrong question makes it a valuable question. And we can definitely unpack that. I mean, metrics are fraught, right? They're useful, they're limiting. When you try and smush metrics and philosophies together, you get all sorts of interesting things, right? I don't want to dismiss metrics altogether, but I also don't want to, what I caution against in terms of metrics is who has access to them and who has power to wield them. And who do they leave out and whose needs do they attend to and whose interests do they attend to? So those are more the questions around metrics that I'm interested in. Then is this the right or wrong metric? Does that make sense? It's kind of similar to my last answer.
Yeah.
Graduate student Sonata Velitis has a question. Maybe we've done it in a perfect democracy where every person in existence has one equal vote and every single decision made that will affect them in some way. It's unachievable in practicality, but maybe this is one good ideal to shoot for.
I mean, it is very, very impractical. It is a great ideal to shoot for, if indeed we could do that. But I wouldn't know what that would look like in, at least in the United States, which is a very large country. I'm not sure if there's a question in there. Okay, I love this. Real time. Oh, okay. That makes sense. Oh, this is great.
I have a question, if I may.
Yeah.
I mean, you said there's a lot of good stuff in the talk, so I have a lot of questions. So I'm having trouble picking which one I want to ask first or which one is most important to me. But I think I'll go with how do you distinguish between epistemological differences and a misunderstanding of the science or ignorance in a conversation with someone?
That's a really good question. And a very important one. I think, so I'll give another one of those non-answers, but one that I think is very important is that your question brings up the notion of trust again, and trust in expertise, rather than distinguishing between, do you believe in science or not, or do you think that a banana is going to kill us or not? So your question raises the notion of trust, and again, sort of how holders of expertise can build that trust so that the difference between the two things that you described is minimized. So in an ideal world, again, sort of like in the hand wavy, one person, one vote, ideal utopian democracy, ideally we would all trust each other, and we could kind of hand off expertise, and those experts will, not break our social contract that we have between us, and then we don't have these sort of QAnon conspiracy corners and all of that. So Yeah, so again, I'm not trying to dodge the question, but I'm trying to refocus the question on our responsibility as knowledge and expertise holders in building trust in that knowledge, rather than like, oh, it's okay to dismiss you because you believe ridiculous things. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. You're just reframing the question around, and I think that using trust as like a squishy metric of success, I think, is maybe a good way of thinking about it, for me at least. If I may, I have a follow-up question to that then.
Sure. Also, by the way, I'm happy to stay for whoever wants to stay longer. Now, I know you all have things to do, but my evening is free.
On this topic of building trust with the people that you interact with and the parties that you engage with, how do you engage with people, bad faith parties? So if maybe this intellectual humility you talked about early at the very beginning, sort of it feels like it requires a mutual respect. And so how do you engage with people that are not offering the same respect that you are trying to extend to them?
That is a very loaded question also. I work on this and am not necessarily successful on a daily basis. Like, this is an ongoing interpersonal question, professional question. I don't think there's a straightforward answer. I don't think dismissal is necessarily the answer, but I also don't think, there's no hard and fast rule. It's not, all about, oh, we are in good faith and you are in bad faith, or vice versa, and therefore, we must bow to you. And clearly, you poor thing, you've lost trust in our institutions. Therefore, no, I mean, that is also not, I don't have an answer is the answer, but I share your concern about trying to figure it out. I'm sorry that I don't have a magic bullet with that. But I guess I will say, sort of from my soapbox, is that, again, we have to do the best we can sort of to do long-term work in the spirit of sustainability and sort of sustainable culture shift, sustainable relationships. Every one of us has a small part to play, but I can't comment on the interpersonal sort of, very, how do you say, like punctual relationship or situation. It was not an English word. Puntual, contained interpersonal interaction. Does that sort of answer your question? Does it validate your concerns, or what about it?
Yeah, I feel, yes, it validates my concerns. I'm glad that I wish there was an easy answer, because that would make everyone's lives a lot better, right? But I guess the ultimate answer is that everything is like process, right? If you both come to the table feeling distrust, like there's a process there too to build trust, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I will add to that, speaking of positionality and situatedness, keep in mind, the power relationships between whoever is having, a good faith or a bad faith, or I guess your question was about bad faith interactions. That also kind of, it helps me, at least on a personal note, it helps me either cultivate empathy with the person or organization that I'm talking with, or it helps me sort of be like, okay, red flag, I have to protect myself, depending on sort of our power situatedness societally.
May I say something back to Sam? I just found his comments really interesting, but I'm not like, okay. So you mentioned that trust seems like kind of a squishy concept, which is true. And like building trust there's like no formulaic way to do it. But I think what I'm getting from this is that there should be an emphasis on, like, when a kid asks an adult a question, how does this work? Why should I do this? if you just say, because I said so, because I'm the nuclear engineer, like that's not going to accomplish anything. Whereas if you explain exactly why, like very, like as if they are in good faith and they just don't understand, then that has some probability of success. And the other thing about like engaging with bad faith parties, like, yes, obviously they exist, people who aren't interested in learning anything. But if you're talking about kind of a democratic discussion between many people, then you can set admissions criteria, like if you're gonna yell and insult people, you're not allowed in the room. And so anyone who can speak respectfully is allowed. So I don't know, I think there are like ways around all these things. And it's just having like conversations about the process and how to communicate and what are the most effective ways to communicate.
Yeah, thank you, Sonata. I hope I pronounced your name right. Did I pronounce your name right?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, definitely. And I will just say a quick yes and the way that what you're saying has traditionally manifested in our field is better education. People need to learn math better, but it's actually not that. And I don't think you were saying that. But I guess I kind of just wanted to point out for the people in the room that have witnessed that for decades, it is about more about the process of communication with the focus of building trust and
yeah, and like I think it would be kind of a cop-out to say like, oh well, you can't explain nuclear energy to someone who hasn't taken calculus 3. Like if you can't help someone in some kind of like understandable analogy, then you don't know what you're talking about.
Yeah, that's very well said. Thank you for that.
It's 5 p.m., so I will invite folks to depart if they desire to do so. Dr. Djokić has kindly invited us to stick around if we would like to, but I also want to be respectful of her time. But so feel free if you have a meeting right now, go on ahead. But thank you.
Thank you, Professor Hove. Thank you all for having me. I'm happy to stick around for about 10 more minutes if you like, if anyone wants to chat.
I have a question for you, Dr. Djokić.
Yes, Dr.
Okay, so you brought up power just now and our situational power societally. So how do we resolve power in the caring process, since all participating parties will inherently have differing levels of power, and even the word expert carries its own implied power, right? So how do we resolve that?
I love that question. And it's a whole
Sorry, I don't know the answer, so I'm asking you.
I don't know the answer either, but I can do my reframing move again. Or no, actually, it's not. I don't necessarily need to reframe that. But I will say that this is a point of conversation in many a scholarship. Mm-hmm. And the critical theorists will probably like go for my jugular if I try and reductively simplify an answer to your question. But what I think is important to highlight is that your question does exactly highlight the implicit and explicit kind of power differentials in knowledge holders, in the expert public divide as we have constructed it, and certain knowledge holders. And the way, I'm not saying that the philosophy of care is necessarily a silver bullet, but it does introduce the notion of centering relationships above power, which isn't actually, okay, again, the critical theorists will shoot all kinds of holes in my answer, but in essence, I think power is not necessarily inherently bad, but tying this whole kind of Q&A back together, if you can manage to center care, and care as sort of like working towards making sure that everyone is okay in its very simplified form, that inherently kind of makes or encourages actors to be okay with the power differentials and sort of giving up power because trust is there. So it's an attempt at an answer. It's extremely reductive and kind of invisibilizes all sorts of debate in STS about trust and expertise and how sort of different camps have unpacked that question. But that's kind of my current working thinking about that. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for answering that. I appreciate it.
Thank you for the question.
I think Professor Abelson has another question. Go ahead.
Beginning with trust, another very fascinating question is, how do you evolve long-held beliefs? And I know there's a work in social psychology, often under the heading of belief theory, that talks about the process by which people's beliefs evolve. You know, part of the problem here is summarized a bit by the little adage that says, man is a creature that would rather believe than know.
Mm-hmm.
Which has its element of truth, right? I'm just wondering if in the scholarship you've looked at and in your own thoughts, there's been discourse about how beliefs evolve.
So this is going to sound like another cop-out, but
Go
again,
for
it's about trust.
Yes, I actually agree. I just wanted to find out your thoughts.
Mm-hmm. So I don't know about anything about the evolution of beliefs as it is situated in the field of social psychology, but from the science and technology studies perspective, I will say that often, so we deconstruct belief more through the lens of establishing trust. Again, belief is sort of there when, no, I'm not going to say this because I'm not entirely sure about this, but I will point you to a recent article in, I believe it is Science, and I wish I had it on hand, but it is by Sheila Jasanoff, who I have mentioned in my talk today, and who was my mentor in the science, technology, and society program at Harvard. Based on both your questions, I think you might find her work and this particular article. Yes, thank you, Dr. Verma. The one that Dr. Verma just put in the chat. I think you will find this article very interesting. It's about, it's kind of deconstructing this narrative of belief in science and refocusing it around trust in institutions. And she says it 1 billion times more eloquently than I ever could. So I would direct you to that article, and everyone else in this Zoom room as well.
That's wonderful. If I may say, the little I know about the belief theory study in psychology, the first point is your point, it's trust, that there's someone with a different belief. And essentially the first thing you do is establish a relationship in which you agree with them. But then in the discourse, ideas are introduced that move the perspective. But
Yeah.
anyway, there's a big scholarship of its own on that whole process.
Thank you for mentioning that. I will dig into it after this talk, after this Q&A. Yeah, I'll go look it up. Thanks. I don't know what
Hearing
time
no
it is.
further
Oh,
questions,
okay.
perhaps we could allow Dr. Djokić to end her evening with our thanks for her presence. So thank you very much. And I think we can end this. And then she has given her email address quite kindly. So, if you have further questions, I know she's very open to questions and thoughts. So.
Yes, please email me. Hold on, I will put my email address again in the chat. There we go. Feel free to reach out. I'm also on Twitter, but I'm a horrible tweeter. So I only go on Twitter when people send me links to Twitter. But you can try there anyway. Sometimes I can respond or not. Oh, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Verma. Appreciate it. Okay, thanks everyone.